Welcome to week 7 of intervention skills. Purpose of this video, I'm going to do two things. First off, at the very end of the video, I'm going to talk about case study number 7 and kind of what I actually did in that situation. So unfortunately, you're going to have to watch the whole video to get to that. But the other part is, as you know, week 7 is really about the competencies for a group process facilitator. And I just want to share with you kind of my story and the experiences that I had throughout my career that kind of led me to this place where I feel very comfortable doing this kind of work. And I just want to emphasize that there are many paths to be in a position where you could really facilitate a group effectively, and you don't have to do any of the things I did. This just happens to be my pathway that I took, not always by choice, but one thing always led to another. So I just want to kind of give you my journey and how I got to this place. And again, everybody's going to have a different journey. So I would say I went to graduate school right out of college because I got a free ride at Miami University. And so I had to pick a major right away. So I picked counseling for my master's degree. And as a result of that, I would say, the first part of my training obviously was from a counseling perspective, the ability to listen, ask questions, probe, guide somebody from point A to point B. And so clearly that was very helpful in my development. But while I was in graduate school, I had various assistantships. One was I was a residence hall director for a hall of 300 freshman men, and I did that 2 out of the 3 years I was there. Why that matters is because I had a staff of anywhere from 8 to 12 RAs. And so working with a team, my own team, and developing them and trying to coach them to work with these students. I was also in that position, the academic advisor for all those freshmen. So that was another angle of kind of coaching and working with people and helping them address strengths, weaknesses, and things like that. So it all kind of played out. One of my assistantships in those 3 years was to be a counselor in the counseling center, where I got direct supervision every day from my supervisor, who would listen to our tapes of our sessions. So again, another avenue that kind of helped. And lastly, another of those 3 years, I was doing alcohol education within the 38 residence halls. And so that was a chance to kind of really develop my stand-up training kind of component of myself. I wouldn't say develop it. I think I was actually just learning it at that point. Probably one of the things that contributed to my deep down confidence in working with groups, particularly in providing education and training, was when I joined Toastmasters International. I had a major fear of public speaking right about my senior year of college. It was building, and I was avoiding any opportunity to speak anywhere. And after graduate school, I landed a job at a university, and they just happened to have a Toastmaster club there, and I didn't know what it was. But once I figured out what it was, I knew I needed to go. And I had since been involved in Toastmasters probably for about maybe 12 years in a row, really kind of just refining my skill set about how to speak in front of people and how to organize a meeting and things like that. So that was really a big key, because what that also led to was, it just so happened I was in California at the time, and Toastmasters International was just down the street. And so I made a connection with the executive director there, really just purely to bring him to one of our Toastmaster Club meetings. Instead, he ended up, after a while of kind of getting to know each other, of offering me a management position at the world headquarters. And why that was significant is because then I left higher education, but then got more into one-on-one training, organizing, and all those kind of things for members across the world. And so we would go out and do these trainings for all the officers of Toastmaster clubs, everywhere, and put on big conferences and all those kind of things. So I kind of learned a lot about behind the scenes, how to run events. let alone continuing to refine my public speaking skills. After that, I ended up taking a job at Mountain States Employers Council here in Denver, which it's kind of like a one-stop shopping for all your HR and management needs. And so I was a management trainer and was able for 9 years to kind of learn all the soft skills training classes and develop those and go out to companies and present them. And then about the halfway mark, 4-year mark, we had consulting services, so I moved into those as well and started doing team building, one-on-one coaching, conflict mediations, team interventions, and things like that. And the beauty was, we had a team. And so I was learning with people. I was co-facilitating in many cases. And, people just kind of took me under their wings, and I just slowly developed that side as well. And in fact, some of the certifications that I developed or took over those years, particularly at Mountain States, but even after that, were, Myers-Briggs training. And actually multiple personality styles trainings, from the DISC to True Colors to now I'm about to get certified in the Hogan assessment. And what those enabled me to do is really kind of dig deeper with groups about personality differences and do work around that, which became very insightful for doing the team intervention kind of work. Group process consultation, I went for a whole week up in Maine for training on that, just very strictly how to understand and work with group dynamics. And we used our own group kind of as the way to do that. I did a facilitator training through a company called People House, 270 hours. And I'll come back to a story about this, but that's probably where I had the breakthrough, where I realized really the art of facilitation. And I'll come back to that one. Will Schutz, who's written The Human Element, a classic book about group dynamics and how people act and feel in groups when they feel accepted and in control and competent. And so I went through a week training there where, again, we used our own group as the model, but developed all those kind of extra competencies around being able to observe and work with groups and push people to the next level should they want to go. Of course, many of you heard the stories, but I did Outward Bound for 10 days, and this was a practicum, Outward Bound, where, again, we used ourselves. We went out in the wilderness for 8 of those 10 days and really did a lot of group work with the 2 facilitators who were psychologists. And part of the purpose of this Outward Bound experience was for them to then, it was like a train the trainer, where they were, after they would do a facilitation with the group, we would sit back and dissect it, talk about why'd you do that, why'd you do this. And that was really my first introduction to outdoor experiential education, which I just loved. And to this day have been combining it with almost all the things that I teach because it was just so, so powerful. Through that, I got certified in the high ropes certification, so taking groups out and putting them on these high ropes type of activities, which, to be honest with you, I've never really used, just because I just haven't gone that way. And I guess my feeling was it takes so long to get people through those events that there's a lot of standing around, and it's a very powerful experience, but I'm not 100% convinced it's a team building type of experience, more as an individual discovery type of experience, which still is great, but because of the time and amount of facilitators you need for something like that, I was a little hesitant to go there. I mean, to really incorporate that heavily into what I do. Many of you may or may not know about groups that evolved from the S training back in the 60s, and one of them was called Life Springs. And I went through that whole system, and it was extremely powerful. And what it was really powerful was really learning and seeing how the facilitators facilitated people getting out of their comfort zone and really taking control over their lives. That became a piece of, the program that I created, along with the outdoor component called Leading from Within, which I've talked about before, but it's an outdoor, indoor, combined experiential leadership program around authentic leadership. The reason I mentioned that is I've been doing that for 19 years now, and usually involves, in most cases, 3 days up in the mountains with intact groups or just public groups. That by the third day, we do a ton of group development work, group sharing, individual activities, and through those 18, 19 years, I've really developed the mindfulness of sequencing events using the outdoor, indoor classroom, solo time, opportunities for a group to bond, what that can lead to, and watching people really take their life to a whole nother level just in those 3 days. Very, very powerful. And that's really fine-tuned a lot of my facilitation skills as well. I also got certified in conflict mediation through CDR in Boulder. And of course, conflict mediation is very much related to the kind of team interventions, because a lot of times the team interventions involve conflict mediations as some of the pre-steps, depending on the relationships that exist. But it's also kind of a high level of facilitation, of helping people identify what's causing the conflict, what those needs are, and how to kind of negotiate around those. Going back to that 270-hour facilitation training I did, what that meant was it was one full weekend a month, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and then every Thursday night we had a training class. And so that all equated to, I'm not sure how long it was, 6 to 9 months. I think it was 9 months. During that time, though, the book we used was The Tao of Leadership. And that's just a book of just these little statements. And yet, really, the facilitation model we were using was based on Taoism. And what I mean by that is that's the ability to be with a group, to kind of create the climate, the safety, and to facilitate the group based on what's going on with them. So in that scenario, we also used ourselves, as the group. But the breakthrough came when the author of the Tao of Leadership, John Hyder, came in for one of the weekends to be our facilitator. And boy, talk about watching the master. And I'll just be real quick about this story, but up until that point, I would say maybe we were a third into it. I was all in my head about facilitation. The right, the wrong way, what should I do? I had all these notes. And continuously in our sessions, they would ask, would somebody like to facilitate and step in the circle and facilitate maybe 2 people or 3 people? And I always kind of backed down at the last minute because I didn't feel competent. And I felt like if I did that, I'd have to have my notes laying around. And, it was all about what I knew and doing it right. Then that weekend with John Hyder came, where watching him facilitate people was just amazing. And what he really taught me was the difference between going out there to facilitate based on trying to do the right thing versus just being totally present with the situation and the people and not having notes and letting go of all that knowledge and just kind of trusting your gut. And I just watched him facilitate somebody that was struggling, and he was just so present with them. And he says, where does it hurt? Where does it hurt? Where are you feeling the pain? And somebody pointed to their stomach. He says, all right, here's what I want you to do. What if your stomach had a voice right now? What would your stomach say? And then he started almost like this Gestalt facilitation of giving a voice to this person's stomach, which then made them start talking about kind of what the pain was about and where they were, how it was impacting them. And then he guided them through that. And it was just so artful. And afterwards, and the person really felt helped, by the way, because they really just kind of thought it through themselves with the help of this facilitator. And that's when I really got that it wasn't about the notes. It wasn't about what you know. Learn everything you can learn and then put it aside and be present with people. And that it's not about you as the facilitator. It's about the group owning that moment. And that was the breakthrough, because I no longer felt like I needed to know how to move a group from point A to point B, because it wasn't my responsibility. All I had to do was ask the group, where are they at? Where do they want to go? What would that look like? What do they need to do? And then I stopped owning, and kind of, I think what really happened was my ego left in the facilitation ability. And that's what freed me up, because then I could just be present for groups. So when I do team assessments, yeah, I go in with a plan A, a plan B, but I'm not attached to anything, because I'm going to let the group guide. And that's kind of what I learned. And I think that probably sparked my confidence more than anything else in the whole facilitation arena. So that's that John Hyder story. After about 9 years at Mountain States Employers Council, where I felt like I really developed everything I needed, I went off on my own so I could just focus on the areas that mattered to me. And those are really more intervention areas: conflict mediation, one-on-one coaching, team building, the Leading from Within program, any kind of team interventions. I still did management training, because as you know from our book, that education is one of the components to bring to a team that you're doing interventions through that whole process. And then I also continued to do keynote addresses around the country, primarily on authentic leadership, but just that ability to get comfort, to develop comfort standing in front of anywhere from 20 to 500 people, and being so passionate about my message that I was able to show up and just be present for people. So that was a big piece of the skill. I also obviously teach at the graduate school at University College, and I've been doing that for now 15 years. And whenever I teach or do training, I'm always incorporating activities where I'm facilitating the activity and trying to help people get from point A to point B. So all of that, just developed kind of a skill set that I bring to team interventions. What I do now at the University of Denver is all the things that I've been talking about: one-on-one coaching, conflict mediation, team building, team interventions, management training, and organizing things like leadership academies and things like that, where there's a whole series of sequencing to put together for people to get the best experience. Sometimes it's outside trainers I bring in, sometimes it's me. It just kind of varies. But so this job really kind of culminates all the learning that I've done. So that's kind of where a lot of my experience came from. And I will say, a lot of trials and tribulations. It wasn't like everything was a home run. As I mentioned to some of you in class, when I was young in the field, I took on everything without really doing an assessment phase, and found out that I was over my head right off the bat. And that changed as I became wiser, more mature, and kind of learned the importance of knowing what you're stepping into before you design anything. So I guess I want to end this part with, one of your discussion board questions was, strengths and growth areas for you as a facilitator if you were ever going to get into this team intervention field. And I would say, without doubt, my strength has been my experience, the 25, 30 years experience in all these areas that I've just mentioned. So, and what that's done is it's given me a lot of confidence. And there's very few situations that I've not seen before. And so I feel comfortable just kind of working with it and going back to that John Hyder moment. I never own it. I'm always giving the best I can, helping the groups, but at the end of the day, it's the group that owns those dynamics. And I've gotten very good at that separation, and I don't use that to kind of critique myself and how I've done in my career. If I had a growth area, and of course I have growth areas, but I would say maybe the biggest one, and I don't know if it's a problem, is I'm kind of comfortable in my style, in the how I move a group through an intervention, work with groups, and I'm not as an eager beaver to learn what the latest, greatest management philosophies or facilitation techniques, because I'm very comfortable in my own skin and how I show up. But I'm also cognizant that I'm not spending all this extra time trying to stay ahead of myself in some of the skill development. And so right now I don't feel like that's a problem, but I think, I've got to be mindful of that as well as I move forward so that I'm role modeling, personal and professional development as I go along. But I think I kind of do that my own way by always assessing, after a situation, what worked, what didn't, what might I do differently. And I keep pretty good notes too. So that's a little bit about the skills that I bring to the table and how I got them, and over a almost 30-year span that have led to me feeling having a comfort level with doing team intervention type of work. All right, so I promised you that I would tell you about the case study and what I did, since on the Canvas there's nowhere there and since we're not meeting this week, it's not there. So here's what happened. I had a plan A and a plan B when I went into that. The plan A was climate setting right off the bat. Keep in mind that many of these people, this group has never done team building, and in fact they haven't really discussed any of their issues with each other than water cooler type of gossip. So they're inexperienced in this group process. So I wanted to go easy, wanted to ease them into the process. Talked about really why I was there. I had the acting director kind of set the stage. Here's why we invited Greg in. I talked a little bit about group dynamics, just kind of a little intro why this is important, to always be proactive and continue to work on yourself. And I told them that this was the perfect time while they were in a state of flux, actually, that, there's no good or bad time, but this was the perfect time to do this kind of work. I introduced myself, talked a little bit about my experience, and identified some outcomes for today and asked if anybody had any additional outcomes. So they were involved in kind of setting the stage. All of that would fall under climate setting, which is really, really important, particularly for groups that are anxious about having conversations that they really haven't had together as a group. So that I did no matter what, but this is still part of plan A. And then I thought maybe, I wrote the Creating Authenticity question book. And so my plan was I would use that. It would kind of be fun, light, they'd get to know each other. It would just kind of ease any kind of tension in the room. And then I thought I would go into, remember I have 2 hours, right? So I would go into what's called appreciative inquiry exercise. There's one of the books I recommended for this class is that book, Appreciative Inquiry. And I went through that book and used it. And it's really team building using appreciative inquiry. And I found probably they divide up their exercises in that book based on what they think the situation is, and the situation I thought was probably most relevant in that book was change management, right? Because they're going through change, they're in the middle of the change right now. They still don't know what the new assistant director is going to be like, what kind of management style. So there's that anxiety. There's the anxiety from being part of a dysfunctional group that it hasn't been resolved yet. So there's a lot of change process going on. So that was the one I picked. And I just tweaked the questions a little bit. And if you don't know about appreciative inquiry, it's like positive psychology. It's really focusing on lessons learned and how to use those lessons learned from the past, this current situation, and how to use those in moving forward as a group, so that they're really focusing on strengths and what they do well and how to take care of each other in that forward movement. So I thought that would probably be the perfect scenario, especially since I only had a total of 2 hours, and climate setting in itself is going to take maybe a half hour. So that's kind of the sequencing I was thinking. And then afterwards, just kind of opening it up to what do we still need to talk about to go forward, so that you guys can be essentially feeling like you're connected as a team as you bring in this new director and assistant director. That was the plan. And then right before the session, I backed out of that idea and my gut was just telling me to try something else. And so I grabbed this set of cards where there's maybe, I don't know, 250, 200 cards that all have a different adjective written on the outside. Kind of artistic looking, but it's really about the adjective. And so at the last minute, what I decided is, after my little opening climate setting, this would be the first activity, and I spread them all out on this big table. And I can't remember exactly, but I believe what I asked them to do is pick a couple cards that represent what this last 2 to 3 months was like for them. You know, a word to describe kind of how they viewed it, and then maybe a third card of what they hope the future entails. So they just, walked around the table, and people just picked up cards, and then they eventually all sat down. And so this was in lieu of the appreciative inquiry exercise. Actually, I took that out and replaced it with two things. So this was the first one, and so they all did that. And it was very, very helpful and insightful, and some people got emotional, and it really gave them an avenue to talk about the past, which I wanted to put closure on before we start talking about the future. So I wanted to transition from past to future. And this ended up being, I thought, a really great way to do it. And like I said, I didn't even think of it until the last minute. So we did that. And then I used another activity, which I've used before. And you can't really see it, but it's, let's see, where are we? It's called all these questions that, and they can be any kind of questions, but this is my standard one. So a strength that I bring to the group, an area where I need to improve upon is what you need to know about me, what I need from my teammates in order to be a better team member, and what you can count on me for. 5 questions. Just ask them to kind of reflect about it. And what I used this for was to kind of air out anything that's still left unsaid. So talking about my strengths, my growth areas, how the team can support me, what you need to know about me, things like that, leading to what you can count on me for. So it just was this filter to get people kind of to share a little bit more about themselves and kind of what the past and present and future has been like for them, because these questions kind of address all of them. And so we did that. We went around the circle again, people just kind of sharing more about themselves and how they could support each other. And then after that piece, I probably maybe had 15 minutes left, we went to what else needs to be discussed in order to move forward. And I think there might have been 1 or 2. And then with whatever 5 minutes I had left, I just kind of reinforced, the importance of the work they just did and how they just took a big step together as a team. And I just left the floor open for closing comments. And there were some amazing closing comments about people either apologizing or thanking the team or feeling connected. And it was just a very nice atmosphere. And I happen to know that the acting director brought in lunch in the same room. Actually, it was happening while we were doing this activity, sequencing. But anyways, and what I mean by that is the distraction of the food company putting stuff in there while we're trying to do this last closing activity. But it worked. In my opinion, it worked. They felt bonded. They aired out grievances. They kind of regrouped. They laughed a little. They probably cried a little. Well, they did cry a little. And at the end, they felt kind of an emotional bond, the relationship piece that frankly has been missing from this team for a long time. And that's because the director just wasn't comfortable going there. And so she kept it task-oriented the whole time that this team was together. And that didn't help, because as people started disagreeing on the tasks, it impacted the relationships. And because the relationships were never addressed, it started bleeding into the task. Now the task and relationship piece was falling apart. That's why both sides got to be managed. And that's why Ready is so big about, group process work is, task facilitation, maintenance facilitation, which is relationship, and then content is the third part, and that you've got to have all three. So that's essentially what happened. It kind of was a kumbaya ending. They don't always happen that way, but that one kind of felt like it was. And I was kind of winging it on the fly, you know, just facilitating with what I thought they needed. And it worked. So there you go. Enjoy your week.